Hannah de Keijzer is an editor and proofreader who helps nonfiction and academic authors navigate the vulnerable process of being edited. She is the author of How to Enjoy Being Edited, a practical guide to help authors find an editing partnership that works for them. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Hannah, thanks for being here.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Um, let's start with the title of your book. How does someone enjoy being edited, and what makes for an enjoyable editing experience?
Yeah, I think there are a few different components. I think it's really helpful if you think through your own goals and expectations of the edit before you go in. What do you especially want help with? What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of your manuscript? How do you personally best receive feedback? And like, what would help you as a writer feel like you know what to do next after you get the edit back? Um, and then communicating all that with your editor is a really huge component to enjoying the edit. If you talk with the editor about those goals and expectations, they'll be able to support them and work toward them with you. And they'll also be able to look for places where your manuscript is or isn't yet meeting those goals and expectations, which makes for a better edit also. I think a big part of enjoying the edit comes from putting in the legwork to find an editor that you really click with, someone you feel like you can trust to hold you and your book both well. And that has a few components to it, reputation as a professional editor, logistical fit, and then vibe fit too. Is this somebody you can have a good time working with? And then lastly, I think coming in with curiosity and desire to grow as a writer always helps. Not every edit is going to be like that. Sometimes, especially with proofreading or something, it's a sort of like check it off, get it done, oh, get this thing out the door at last situation, which is great too. But especially on those early stages of editing, which can be especially vulnerable, if you can balance that vulnerability with a desire to see your book be the best it can be, to grow as a writer, to be curious about what the editor finds, that can really help. And when you feel defensive or overwhelmed or too vulnerable, you can always take a day or two away and just step back, process, cool off so you can come back with an open mind. It's always okay to take it at a slower pace.
Editing can be so strange because I can remember there was one article I had to edit one time, and I gave some notes. I thought they were pretty mild. The writer never spoke to me again and withdrew the article for consideration in the publication I was editing it for.
Oh, that's
Um,
too bad.
it's really, yeah, it was awful. But it seems to me like as someone who has been edited just a lot, I I'm a professional. The work is the work. Me as a person is separate from that. And one way I think about it, it's kind of like there's a thing of like was it Marcus Aurelius said that like when a boxer is in the ring and they get hit, they don't think the person who hit them is mean or is a bad person or right. I mean, it's a sport and and is there a to me that works as an analogy for editing. Is there a pep talk you could give someone to help them understand kind of the emotional side of editing and how to maybe detach a little bit so that they can understand that this is a professional act that is ultimately designed to make the work as good as it can be, and it isn't a critique of them as a person. If
Yeah.
that makes sense, I feel like that's a really rambly way to put it.
No, it makes perfect sense. I think the fear at the heart of a lot of that is a fear of judgment, being judged as a writer or judged as a person by the editor. And that's a really, really common fear. It's one that came up a lot in the surveys that I ran as I was writing my book. And the distinction that I like to draw there is between judgment and discernment. They're both actually judgment, but right. A good editor is not judging you as a human at all. They're using the discernment sense of judgment for the work to say, okay, is the writing here living up to what the author wants it to be yet or not? And my job as an editor is to help match the writing on the page and the structure of the book to their intention, to make it as compelling and engaging as possible. And it is sometimes very, very hard as a writer. I mean, I have also been edited, right? It can be very hard to separate those two things. But I think, and this is another place that finding an editor you like and trust helps because you feel safer with somebody whose way of expressing themselves you feel seen in, who communicates in a way that makes sense to your brain. That all creates a sort of sense of safety that can help pass off. And some of it is practice also, right? The more you're edited, the more you come to realize that it's in service of the work.
Yes, that makes sense. And I guess if I were to return to a sparring analogy, someone just hitting you outside of the context of a boxing lesson or something is way out of line. And I guess you'd want to prevent that because I think also there can be a nasty side to editing if someone, if it's not if you don't have that trust that you're speaking of
Right.
both
That's
ways.
why I emphasize the finding the right fit so hard because I really think it makes a huge difference. And you enter into a contractual agreement that is often literally contractual, right? Because it's a business agreement, but also a sort of relational contract of mutual care and goodwill with the work at the heart of it, ideally. So you're only hit in the ring if you're hit at all.
Yeah, ideally, no one's getting hit.
Yeah, the analogy is strong, but I also flinch a little.
That's that's like a 1-star Spotify review right there. Someone's gonna be like, this is like Hemingway nonsense, making boxing analogies. Um, one thing like to that point though, I've had the very special opportunity to work with some authors who are writing about really like traumatic experiences and stories of survival. And I'm wondering if you have any advice to someone who's entering the editing process with that sort of material on either as an editor or as the author.
That's a great question. I think that being very upfront initially, as much as is possible for you, the author, with what is in the manuscript and why it is a challenge or a potential challenge to receive feedback on, will help the editor know how to handle that material. Not every editor is going to want to handle material like that also. This is one of the places where, editors want to see your manuscript before they take on the work. And part of that is looking at what level of editing you really need and sort of logistical things. And part of that is, hey, am I the editor, the right person to work on this manuscript? Because maybe I don't feel like I can be objective. Maybe I'm not emotionally able to handle what's in the book. And so I need to be honest about that for the author's sake and my own, and hopefully be able to recommend somebody who might be able to take it on instead. But I think that's a place where an open conversation early in the process is very helpful. And I think that's also a place where the author thinking through how they have received feedback well in the past can be really helpful. Because if they know that it's hard for them to read written comments and not feel attacked or not feel like it's really pointing right at the heart of something that's very tender, they may want to ask their editor for verbal feedback instead, or vice versa. Or if they may want to ask the editor to phrase every suggestion in the really tender parts as a question or a recommendation rather than just making the change, something like that.
Hmm. It's probably good for any project to present those different options for communication styles.
Yeah, it can help anybody, but I think particularly in those more tender and challenging experience books. And I've worked on memoirs as well that have some of that need for extra care.
You mentioned the different stages of editing, and I am always amazed by how these get confused. And like I had actually like written books and like worked with editors in a professional capacity before I really had a working knowledge of what a developmental edit is versus a copy edit, etc. Can you walk me through the different stages of editing and kind of what each one is all about and how they're different?
Absolutely. That confusion is totally understandable. It's not helped by the fact that there are different names for the same basic kind of editing, and editors may use different name, like use the same name to mean slightly different things. So you get slightly different answers from other people. So totally, totally understandable. I'm gonna roll with the definitions that I use in my work and have sort of accumulated out of lots and lots and lots of conversations about this with lots of other editors. Um, so thinking about it from a sort of manuscript lifespan perspective, right? The earliest draft, I mean, in the very beginning, you might want to work with a book coach or a writing coach. If your draft isn't done and you're having trouble getting words on the page, that's probably a sort of coaching perspective, coaching moment. Um, the first level of editing, when the draft is done, usually, this is another fuzzy little place here, but usually when the first draft is done, you feel like it's got some chops, but you want to know about how is it hanging together? Is it speaking to my audience? Is the structure right? Is the logical flow there? What's missing? What have I not seen because I'm the expert and the reader isn't the expert, but I think they know this thing and they don't. Those kinds of big structural questions are the purview of a developmental edit, sometimes also called a content edit or a substantive edit or a structural edit. But if an editor is working at the really big picture, whole manuscript level, that's a developmental edit. Then you're going to need to revise your manuscript really extensively in response to that edit, which is an opportunity to make it flow well and make the reader feel comfortable inside it and get them all the information they really need. So it's a wonderful opportunity. Then you move to language edit, and language edit can be kind of split into line editing and copy editing.
Mm.
Line editing, and again, this is a place where there's some overlap. Some editors kind of do both levels in one. You got to talk to your editor to find out what their expectation is and what they're offering and match it to what you need and want. But the line edit is about flow, rhythm, clarity, voice, tone, the kind of intangible feeling of the writing in a way. And it really gets in there and works at the word choice level and the sentence structure level and the paragraph level. And your editor is going to get in there and it's going to look really marked up. And then you have the chance to accept their changes, reject them, revise in response. You're going to be doing more work on the manuscript after the line edit. Then there's a copy edit. And a copy editors are absolute geniuses who know so many rules about like what a standard book language is like. And they bring your manuscript into alignment with the style guides for your publishing house or the Chicago Manual of Style, which is what American books generally line up with. So it's consistency of detail, it's grammar, it's again somewhat flow, but at a sort of more sentence structure level rather than word choice level. And after a copy edit, you really should not be revising your manuscript anymore. That is a cleanup round. Hands off, please. If you really have to make changes, see if you can send it back to your copy editor for a check, because this is about making it clean. And then proofreading is about really making it clean at the very end, ideally after it's been laid out in its final format, because proofreaders can check the visual stuff too, right? Like matching page numbers to the table of contents, and does the figure caption work, and all those tiny, tiny details that it's so hard, basically impossible for anyone who's already looked at the manuscript closely to see, because our brain fills in what we expect it to see rather than what's actually on the page.
Every one of those little kind of cautionary asides you mentioned, I can think of a specific example of a time where something what either had to go back to a copy editor, or it had never been to a copy editor in the first place. Now it's a problem. And um, the one really crazy, like mind-blowing thing that I remember learning as I did more developmental editing as part of what I do, is that developmental editing can happen before the fact. That in theory, the conversations about what your book idea actually is are part of a developmental edit before you've even written anything.
Yeah, there's definite fungibility between coaching and developmental editing. And yeah, the it is absolutely a gray area, and asking developmental edit questions before you start to write, as you say, can make the structure hang really well from the beginning, such that you don't actually need a developmental edit. You can move right to a language edit. Um, but many people don't go in with a kind of structural mindset to the writing process, or they're folks who think by writing, which I also totally encourage. I mean, lots of people say you have to have an outline, and I think that it can be very helpful, but not everybody's brain works that way. And so if you haven't done that work, and hopefully you do your own revision to align it with a clearer structure after that first draft is done. But if you need help with that and you haven't yet worked with somebody, developmental edit is where to go.
Mm. Now, how can somebody who is not a storytelling professional of any stripe be brutally honest about what stage of editing they require? And because I know, like, I have done some heavy duty rewrites on manuscripts that quote unquote just needed a proofread. Or, and you know, even in some of my own work, I think there's a tendency to think you're almost one level ahead of where you actually are. Is there a good rule of thumb for sizing that up?
Rule of thumb, I don't know, but I can share some thoughts. They may not be quite as concise as a little rule of thumb. Um, I think fundamentally this is an education thing, that it's part of editors' jobs to help writers to talk and talk and talk about these different levels of editing and when they're useful and why they're useful, so that authors understand that the levels of editing exist, and that a manuscript always has all these different needs at different parts of its life. And so either you hire someone to work with you to kind of address those needs, or you learn to revise to meet those needs yourself. Um, but it's hard to do that if this is your first book and you don't know kind of the steps to making it really solid and compelling to the reader. So I think it's on editors to talk about this a lot and educate folks about it. Um, I think it's also on us as editors to look at the whole manuscript when we're thinking about taking on a project, and be honest about what's needed to the client and to ourselves. I think we do a disservice to both parties if we take on something, they think it just needs a light tweak, we see that it needs a heavy rewrite. If we don't have a really open conversation about that, and align the expectations and explain why we think it needs what it needs and get their approval and understanding, um, and charge accordingly, right? I think we're doing everybody a disservice. And if we feel strongly that the manuscript needs deep work and the author just isn't interested in that, then it's not a good match, not a good editor author match.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and ask like why do you enjoy editing? Because I think writing, it almost reminds me of like playing guitar. Like it has this very obvious appeal, and a lot of people sort of think they can do it. But nobody edits their way through their first breakup or like turns to editing the way they do with writing to like just make sense of life. I mean, how did you discover editing and what makes it enjoyable to you?
Yeah. I discovered it in a way I didn't really stand a chance because my dad's was a professional writer, and my mom managed a bookstore. And so I grew up in a house of books, like thinking about words, seeing somebody making a life out of words and knowing that that was a possibility, which I'm very grateful for. And when I was in college, my dad and his co-author were editing a volume at that time, and they needed some extra hands. And so they hired me to help do some editorial work and sort of introduce me to like how this is how a book is put together and all that stuff. And I just kind of got bitten by the bug. I really liked it. I have always seen editing as a kind of a puzzle, which is fun to me. It's like, I love jigsaw puzzles too, but this is like a big three-dimensional, complex, human-centered puzzle. Like, what are all these components? How do they best fit together for the reader and to meet the goals that we're trying to meet and all that kind of stuff? Like, I just find it interesting. Um, so that started it. I mean, I worked at a publishing house for a while. Like it went from there, but that was the initial seed. And I work only with nonfiction, so I get to learn about all these different little corners of the world and perspectives and ideas that I probably would never encounter otherwise. That's a total delight to me. And the processes at the heart of editing are ones that I've always really loved and used in various ways through my life and career. Really deep listening, distilling complicated ideas into accessible forms, catalyzing other people's creative visions, like helping bring a book-shaped object to life is very satisfying for me. And I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's definitely mine. And I also, you didn't mention this yet, but I do work as a book coach as well. And that's a big component of my work these days. And I really love that for how collaborative it is. I ran a collaborative dance theater company for a decade, and I found that as I was editing full time, I missed that in-depth, like talk about it, work it out together, really that sensation of together we are making this happen in the moment, in conversation. And so coaching has been a wonderful, satisfying way for me to get that and to give that to authors as well.
Yeah, I do want to talk about coaching. The thing that I guess it sounds really obvious, but I didn't think about this. I got some feedback from a coaching client at one point, and he was saying like it just felt good to not have to do it alone.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I guess that's really true. That it's because it can be so scary to solo a book.
Yeah. And it's a long haul process. Even if you've done it before, even if you are a really skilled writer, you know what you're doing, you have the plan. There are very few people who write a book quickly. I mean, they exist in the world. That's great for them. Hooray. But generally, for most humans, it's a pretty long haul process. It takes so much thought and effort and energy and time to get from that first initial idea to holding a book in your hands and sharing it with the world. And that is a lot to take on alone. And it's really lovely often to share the burden of planning, holding the vision, generating momentum so that you don't have to be the only one to do that.
And there's something too of like seeing someone hit those milestones that you know well from having taken that same route yourself. And it's yeah, it's a very there's something uniquely satisfying about book coaching, even though sometimes I don't know about you, sometimes I feel like I'm not doing much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mark of a good coach is when you can also get out of the way. You
Mm.
don't always have to make changes, but I think I agree with you about how satisfying it can be.
Somebody I think we both follow on LinkedIn posted something about like what do you do to decompress or in your time off or some work-life balance thing. And my thing is expedition sea kayaking. There's this one little trip that I like to do kind of near where I live where I take people to this cove and it's not far. Like anyone, even if you've never kayaked before, we could do this. And we set up a little camp stove and make coffee. And it's like you could do it on a weekday. It takes like an hour and a half. But it's the satisfaction of seeing people realize that you can like do this and get to a place you can only get to in a kayak and have your coffee break there. To me, that's what book coaching feels like sometimes. You're taking someone to another place that you where you do need a guide sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's showing, I mean, I orient around delight and appreciation generally as a human, and so I bring that to my coaching and showing people where the joy and the pleasure is in the process, where that's available is really an important part of it to me. And that your kayaking story sounds like just like that. It's like, this is a secret little way that this can be a real joy. Look at this opportunity. And I absolutely see that in.
Is there anything that dancing has taught you about the process of writing, editing?
I mean, I approach writing as a physical process more than most people might.
Hmm.
So I was also a massage therapist for a really long time. So I have a very deep body and physicality orientation. And I don't bring that in if people are completely uninterested in it, but it is a set of tools in my toolkit to offer writers that tends to surprise people and create a lot of momentum. Um, whether it's thinking through how their workspace is working for or against them and how their body feels in the space where they're writing, because that can make a huge difference to how well the words flow. Um, or whether it's creating sort of physical processes to help you drop in and out of writing sessions so that you can pick up right where you left off. Um, sometimes it's about giving people permission to use their bodies in space, whether that's writing by hand, whether that's talking into a microphone while they walk, whether that's like, oh, you feel an impulse to cut up your manuscript and put it all over the floor and move those pieces around. Do it. Why are you holding yourself back? Yeah, our body can help you. Your body can help you think if you do that. That's great. Use your body to help you think. So I definitely bring that orientation to the work. And I have a particular branch of my coaching life that's just about that kind of workspace tweaking, reducing friction in the workspace and making it a place that's easeful for what you need to do with your brain and body.
Wow. It sounds like we need to have like a follow-up episode on that.
Yeah.
That sounds really helpful for like people with ADHD, especially anyone who kind of has a where for whom sitting still is a challenge or where there almost needs to be a like I don't want to say a gimmick, but like there needs to be like I use a mechanical keyboard where it has that clicky sound. I
Mhm.
found that by making things a little more tactile, it makes it easier to stay focused.
Yeah. Yeah, I think having objects that you can use physically in that way or like is really useful for many folks who, as my colleague and friend Vicky Quinn Fraser says, have brain bees.
Brain brain bees. I like that.
Yeah.
Um, so do you have like an ultimate editing hot take? Like something that isn't in every style guide, something that's maybe gonna like start a fight in an at an editing party.
I feel like this is going to be really disappointing to you and your listeners, but no, I don't. I don't have a gonna start a fight take. I think that I bang the drum more loudly than most people about a thing, about an approach to editing, but I'm definitely not the only one who thinks this. Um, but I really see editing as a partnership, as nourishment, as an opportunity. And I think more and more people are talking about that. It's not how it's sort of typically held, I think. And so I guess I would put that forward as my hottest hot take on it. But I think that's holding editing that way is the way to improve your book the most and have the best possible experience.
Mm. And is it fair to say that, excuse me, maybe that the hot take is that the if the parts about editing that are sort of most effective are actually quite simple and not controversial, and it's I don't know. When I think of the really good editors I know, they're all masters of the basics.
Mm. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think good editing takes a lot of flexibility.
Mm.
Um, if you're interested only in the style guide and not the author and the book, you're doing a disservice, I think. Maybe that's a spicier take for you than the first, but
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, you're among friends if you're in any way anti-style guide. Not that there isn't a time and a place, but
yeah, I'm definitely not anti-style guide. I mean, I proofread. I love checking those footnotes for consistency, weirdo brain that I have. But on the other levels of editing, I think you've gotta leave room for who's writing the book and what they're trying to say. And I think there's a lot of systemic bias baked into style and the choices that have come to be accepted as professional or worthy of a book too. So we always need to be really careful about that.
mm, there's yeah, even I saw something recently where somebody was saying how, like is wrong, it needs to be such as.
For listeners who can't see me, I just made a face.
That was quite a famous. Well, I mean, and all I could think of, I mean, I'm working on a book proposal now with a guy where there's no way. Like if you could just see his author photo and you would know this is not a man who goes around saying such as.
Yeah, exactly. If you the choice, it's not about there are choices that are about correctness, but not every choice has to be about correctness. And also sometimes people really dig into the sand on very specific choices like this. I'm like, but are you sure that that's the most up-to-date usage of that word anyway? Like, language changes over time, and we have to keep up with it.
Yeah, and which language? I mean, I think that these things and again, I guess that's to your point of understanding context, understanding the author, understanding the intention. I do think that, I mean, and maybe this is a hot take, but that it's like that bell curve thing that for the average middle, you should probably follow the rules. And if you're breaking the rules, it's either because it's through total incompetence and like the Dunning-Kruger effect, or because like you are so good that you know exactly how and when to break them without creating confusion or error or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to being intentional or deliberate, right? Knowing the choice you're making and then applying that choice consistently,
Mm,
which if you have a good conversation with your copy editor, you can talk about. They can help you make your choice consistent through the whole book. And so you haven't just missed one or two instances where it should have been the way that you wanted it and it wasn't yet.
right. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I am coaching a couple of really interesting books. I've got one on the American political system. I've got one on marketing and higher education. Um, I've got one on the tarot. I've got a very broad range right now, which is fun for me. And then I am just launching a new editing project with somebody that's about bookmaking, actually, which is a delight.
Like physical bookmaking or
Uh, Book publishing with a feel of that artisanal physical bookmaking.
oh cool.
Yeah.
One other thing I've asked ghostwriters this, and I'd love to get your opinion. I would imagine that given, one of the things you like about nonfiction is this diversity of topics and ideas and authors. And I would imagine sometimes that includes working on stuff that you kind of either don't agree with or you maybe don't, it's like just not your thing. How do you navigate that personally, and where do you draw a line for the kind of work you won't do versus you don't agree or it's not your thing, but you will work on it? If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
I'm fortunate to be at a place running my business where I can choose to take on projects that I think I'm a good fit for and that are a good fit for me, and I can really ascertain mutual fit. So I am an inherently pretty open-minded person. And if I think that I can help the writer, will happily take on projects that are on a subject that I might know less about, or um, depending on how I'm trying to help them, obviously. Um, and if as long as I'm open in initial conversations with them that that's where I'm coming from and they're comfortable with that, and it suits what they need, then that's fine with me. If there is material in a book that makes me profoundly uncomfortable for any set of reasons, I am unlikely to take that project on because I don't, I won't be available enough emotionally and intellectually to do the work justice. So I don't think that I would be the best editor for them. And if I can, I will help them try to find somebody else. But I don't take on projects where I feel like I'm a mismatch for either the writer's own vibe or the ideas that they're putting forward.
Mm, nice. Um, Hannah, this is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really fun to talk to you, Charlie.
Where can listeners find you?
My website is hannahdk.com. So HANNAHDK.com. That's the easiest place to find me. And then I hang out a lot on LinkedIn. Search for Hannah Editor and you'll probably find me.
Sweet. Thanks again.
Thank you.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Hannah's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.